Chapter 2. The First Biologist. At the stern of a small boat off the coast of Lesbos on the Aegean Sea, Aristotle leaned far over the clear, shallow water, looking down at a catfish that was laying its eggs among the reeds. Hour after hour he watched, holding his boat steady with a strong pull so that it would not float away. When darkness came down over the water, so that he could no longer see, he pulled up the pole and rowed back to the shore. In his study, by the light of an oil lamp, he made a record of what he had seen. Quote, the catfish deposits its eggs in the shallow water, generally close to the roots or close to the reeds. The eggs are sticky and adhere to the roots. The female catfish, having laid her eggs, goes away. The male stays on and watches over the eggs, keeping off all other little fishes that might steal the fish or fry. He thus continues for 40 or 50 days, till the young are sufficiently grown to escape from the other fishes themselves. Fishermen can tell where he is on guard, for in warding off the little fishes, he sometimes makes a rush in the water and gives utterance to a kind of muttering noise. Knowing his earnestness in parental duty, the fisherman drags into the shallow place the roots of water plants to which the eggs are attached, and there the male fish, still keeping by the young, is caught by the hook when snapping at the other fish that come by. Even if he perceive the hook, he will still keep by his charge, and will even bite the hook in pieces with his teeth. Unquote. After he had watched the breeding habits of the catfish for a long time, Aristotle began to study other things about fish. Quote, fishes can produce no voice, he wrote, for they have no lungs or windpipe, but certain of them, as the catfish in the river Achelous, emit inarticulate sounds and squeaks by rubbing motion of their gill covers. Unquote. Again he studied the torpedo fish. Quote, it stuns the creatures that it wants to catch, overpowering them with the force of shock in its body and feeding upon them, he observed. And he wrote of the fish called the angler. Quote, he stirs himself up a place where there is plenty of mud and sand and hides himself there. He has a filament projecting in front of his eyes. The filament is long and thin and hair-like and rounded at the tip. It is used as bait. Little creatures on which this fish feeds swim up to the filament, taking it for a bit of seaweed they can eat. Then the angler raises the filament, and when the little fishes strike against it, he sucks them down into his mouth. Unquote. So day after day, from the stern of his little boat near the shore, Aristotle watched the life of the underwater world unfold. Everyone had seen fish before, and the fishermen knew something about their habits, for this knowledge helped them get a bigger catch. But until then, no one had watched the ways of fish for the single purpose of trying to understand them. No one had reasoned before Aristotle's time that if he could observe and record the ways of marine animals, he would have made a beginning toward understanding life itself. Life and the ways of creatures were for Aristotle an absorbing mystery. He wanted to understand the growth and death of the olive tree, a violet blooming on the hillside, a clam in the sand, a bee, a goat, a man. Aristotle thought that if he observed every living thing carefully enough and recorded what he saw, he would come closer to an understanding of life. He had great patience and an extraordinary power of observation, and besides these two essential qualities, he had an imagination which made it possible for him to interpret what he saw. It is not strange that those who followed him thought it was useless to try to add anything to his knowledge. Modern scientists might think that Aristotle worked under great disadvantages. He had no books to consult, for no books on natural history had been written. He had no scientific training, no scientific instruments, no colleagues with whom he could discuss his findings. What he did have was inexhaustible energy and enthusiasm, and a love of living things. Sometimes when he wrote of his observations, he drew diagrams to make his meaning clear, the first such diagrams in scientific writing. He refers to them often in his writings, but unfortunately these diagrams have been lost. After a time, Aristotle left the study of fishes and began to study mammals. He knew very well the difference between mammals and fishes. Quote, "All mammals have lungs, breathe air, and have warm blood," he said. "They bring forth their young alive. Among them are man, the horse, the seal, and also marine animals like the whale and the dolphin. The dolphin has been seen asleep with his nose above the water and snoring," he wrote. Aristotle was by no means a young man when he began his study of natural history. He had been born in the town of Stagira on the Macedonian frontier. But his father, Nicomachus, a rich physician employed by Amyntas II of Macedonia, had great ambitions for his son and had sent him to Athens at the age of 17. Athens then was the center of all grace and beauty, of lovely architecture, of drama and music. Here the young Aristotle was enrolled at the academy, in whose gardens fortunate young men studied logic, poetry, and philosophy under the great teacher, Plato. It was not long before Aristotle became distinguished at the academy. Plato called Aristotle's house, quote, "the house of the reader," for he had collected a great number of parchment scrolls there, the first true library in Europe. Aristotle remained at the academy for 20 years, and at Plato's death many thought he would become its head. But instead he crossed the Aegean to live at the court of Hermias, the rich king of Asia Minor, and here he married the king's sister, Pythias. It was here on the shore of the Lesbian Gulf that he began his biological studies. But they had been carried on for only about 5 years when another change came in Aristotle's life. Philip, king of Macedonia, asked him to be tutor to Alexander, his son. Alexander was a boy of 13 then, a passionate youth who loved to tame wild horses that no one else could tame. Plutarch said, quote, "For a while Alexander loved and cherished Aristotle no less than if he had been his own father, saying that if he had received life from the one, the other had taught him the art of living," unquote. But Aristotle and Alexander remained together only a few years. Then Alexander, having inherited his father's throne, set off on his Asian expedition, and Aristotle, after a brief period of travel, settled down in Athens again. Here he helped establish a great zoological garden. Pliny, writing in 77 AD, said that Alexander founded it. He wrote, quote, "Alexander the Great, fired by the desire to learn of the nature of animals, entrusted the persecution of this design to Aristotle. For this end, he placed at his disposal some thousands of men in every part of Asia and Greece, and among them hunters, fowlers, fishers, park keepers, herdsmen, bee wards, as well as keepers of fish ponds and aviaries, in order that no creature might escape his notice. Though the information thus collected, he, Aristotle, was able to compose some 50 volumes," unquote. Having the direction of such a great undertaking as this, and composing some 50 volumes, might seem enough, but Aristotle wanted to share his findings with others, and to have them help him with his research. That was why he founded his great school, the Lyceum. The Lyceum was to be a very different place from the academy in which he had studied under Plato for so many years. Plato had discussed philosophy and poetry with his young Athenians, but the Lyceum was a scientific school. Here, Aristotle dreamed all the knowledge that had been accumulated through the years would be organized and set down for future generations to build upon. The school was called the Lyceum because it was situated in the grounds of the temple of Apollo Lysias, the god who protected the flocks from attacking wolves. There was a long promenade along the athletic field of the temple, and here the students talked with the master as they strolled up and down. In the morning, Aristotle's pupils were the older men, gray-haired and full of knowledge. In the afternoon, they were the young men. What did they talk about, strolling back and forth beside the level green stretch of the athletic field? They talked of the living principle, the essence that distinguished all living things. Aristotle called this the psyche or soul, meaning the principle of life. He thought there were different kinds of psyches and that therefore one could distinguish between the vegetable, the animal, and the human soul. Plants have the lowest form of soul, he said. They take food from the environment around them. They grow and reproduce. Animals have these powers too, but they can also move from place to place, while men, having all of the powers possessed by plants and animals, can in addition reason and control their actions. Between all these living things there must be some connection, and Aristotle attempted to arrange them in a great ladder, the scala natura, as it was called later. Quote, nature proceeds little by little from things lifeless to animal life in such a way that it is impossible to determine the exact line of demarcation, nor on which side thereof an immediate form should lie. Thus, next after lifeless things in an upward scale comes the plant. Of plants, one will differ from another as to its amount of apparent vitality. In fact, the whole plant kind, whilst devoid of life as compared with animal kind, is endowed with life as compared with other forms of matter. Indeed, there is in plants a continual scale of ascent toward the animal. Thus, one is at a loss to say of certain beings in the sea whether they be animal or vegetable. Unquote. So Aristotle talked with his pupils, and he set down his conclusions in book after book, a great compendium of knowledge. Many of his observations and conclusions have been verified by later scientists. Many are still under discussion. For example, there are today two main schools of biologists: the vitalists, who believe, as Aristotle did, that the function of a living organism are due to its vital force, distinct from physical forces, and the mechanists, who regard all phenomena of nature as caused by merely mechanical forces. For 12 years, Aristotle and his scholars worked, assembling their great mass of knowledge, writing many books. They investigated the beginnings of life in the embryo. Quote, he who sees things grow from the beginning will have the finest view of them, unquote, they said. They raised questions of heredity. A white woman of Elis married a Negro. Their children were all white, but in the next generation some black skins appeared. Where was the blackness hidden in the middle generation? They examined structures of plants and wondered at the effect of the sun on them. Most of Aristotle's books have been lost, but enough of his writings remain to establish him as probably the greatest biologist that ever lived. And what happened to him? How did it end? Alexander the Great died of a fever in Babylon. There was a revolution of the Greeks against Macedonian rule. Everyone who had any connection with Alexander was suspect. They said that Aristotle should be tried for godlessness. Aristotle must have known what the outcome of such a trial would be. Perhaps he thought of the fate of Socrates, who had also been tried for godlessness. He left the Lyceum and took a ship to the island of Euboea, but he lived for only about a year after that. After Aristotle's death, when peace was restored in Athens and the Lyceum was reopened, Theophrastus, his pupil, became its head. Theophrastus lived to be a very old man, and when he died he left a will providing money to preserve a marble bust of his master. That is why the face of the first biologist is familiar to us after more than 2,000 years.